Good afternoon, everyone. So you've heard a lot about collective impact over the last couple of days, and I can help you operationalize that, but I thought before we start having me talk at you anymore, that I would just answer your questions, because I can share any information that I want to share with you through the context of things you care about, if that's an okay place to start. Is that okay? Mm-hmm. So if you can frame up your questions in pretty succinctly so that we can get a lot of them in, then I will answer them and break down collective impact and how we would do it in our own view. So who has some questions? Yes.
I guess it's just some of the system stuff and how to work with that collective impact. So for instance, some of the government departments work differently. So particularly around youth.
Yes.
We work with a lot of, let's say, 15-year-olds who have been kicked out of home and therefore they're homeless and this, that, and that. So they're able then to go into Centrelink and be declared independent and get an independent allowance, so they're getting an income. Child Protection also deemed that probably it's unsafe for them to return home, so here you are, a young 15-year-old getting an income. On the same process, then they want to seek accommodation because they've been told, you know, it's not safe for them to go home, they're getting an income. You cannot sign a lease until you're actually 16 or then 18 to get an actual tenancy. So I'm a little bit confused, and I'm interested in the collective impact around how can we best start to look at those different systems. So when they want to come and sign a tenancy agreement at 15, the government or the housing part is saying, no, that's the responsibility of Child Protection. We can't get anyone under 18 to sign a tenancy.
Totally got it.
Okay, I knew.
So, so to me, collective impact is really always about starting with a population. To me, it's always about starting with a population, not a problem. And then we can ask the question, what do we want for that population, right? That's the result. You want children to be able to be accommodated and be able to be self-sufficient on their own, correct? That's what you want. So let's just say that that's the case. Safe children for right now are independent. I'm just being abbreviated. We know that means home, right?
Yeah.
Let's just say that was what we want. And one of the ways we would measure that, so let's just say we want children to be safe and independent. One of the ways we would measure if we were making progress on this is then we would have an indicator. And let's just say that is being able to get leases that are executed, because that lets you know that they're in a home, right? Now, when we think about the population, we want to get very clear about the numbers, right? So there's a population, let's say, of 16-year-olds out there. Not all of the 16-year-olds, say, in this city need your assistance. Maybe it's 2,000. That's our population. Does that make sense? Of this 2,000, now we can go to work. So you see, automatically, we're getting to a big scale. We're not talking about one instance. We're not talking about a few. We're talking about the population needs this type of systems improvement, right? This is why it's always important to start here. Because sometimes we just get into the weeds before we've really even figured out, is this really a big deal? Is it really enough? Everything's a big deal when our work is very important and lives depend on it. But is it big enough to really get people motivated to act, right? That's what we're trying to figure out. So that's why we start with the population. We got the result. We got one measure. We could have multiple measures, right? But we got this measure. Now when we have the measure, we can begin to talk about what I call the story behind the curve story. And the story behind the curve is what's going on with this indicator, right? So you might end up doing something that says we got 2,000 children unable to get a lease. No lease. And then here's why. You're able to start telling me why. You see my point? Because when you tell me why, then we can come over here and we can come up with evidence-based solutions. You see how we didn't jump to the solutions yet? You see my point? We got to really understand, why is this happening, right? Once we understand, then we can come up with some proposals, right? But in addition to that, we can also come up with what's very important, which is a target. Let's say for years 1 through 5. Working with 2,000 kids is a big deal. That's not going to happen overnight. So we want to say over the next 5 years, we want to totally solve this for this group. So these are our targets. So every year we'd be able to say how many we want to do, right? So when we come up with our evidence-based solutions, what we are then saying is, if we implement these solutions, we get this is our baseline. This is where we're starting, right? We're going to start getting this going up. Year 1, year 2, etc., right? And we know that in year 1, we're just going to try to figure this out. We're only going to work with 100 kids. We're going to try to really figure this out, because then we can accelerate if we get it done, right? We know we have some evidence-based solutions. It may not be programs here. This is important. It may be systems things that you're working with. Does that make sense? Yeah. There may be, in the States we call them landlords. You might find property owners who are willing to work with you in this case. So when Jim was talking about community this morning, you might say, all these formal processes don't work. I'm going to go in my community and I'm going to find those property owners who know that these kids have money that's coming in every month. I'm going to work out an agreement with them to say, can you make these kids a priority on your list? I'm going to be a steady feeder to your properties. Now, you don't have to do all that advertising and recruitment. I got you. Does that make sense? That's community building. So before we get to all this grand scheme, we're actually going to go to the community and say, are there landlords here? Are there property owners in our community who could use some tenants? And we're going to work with them to say, you know what? We just have a little problem. We just need you to be able to waive this little requirement, and you know you got your check every month. We can solve the problem. You see my point? But what we did is, that might just be a partial solution. That might be one strategy that'll work, but there may not be enough property owners. You see my point? So now we can work and see if there's a systems thing we can do in your agency and other agencies. There's a community thing we can do. Who in the community can help us move right now? Because while we're waiting to go through all that bureaucratic stuff, these kids still need homes, right? So that's the community response, right? And then you might have an agency-specific response. Does that make sense so far? How we're talking about breaking this down? That's how you're actually bringing it together. So that's why I said you have to hold the complexity. Because when I'm talking about community impact, collective impact, I am talking about community work. I'm also talking about systems work. And I think our job has to be able to do both. This is not a community problem. This is a systems problem that's got a requirement around a criteria that is keeping kids from finding affordable housing. The community is not taking them into their homes, so it's not a community problem, right? The community can help you solve it, though. I can make the case to my management, this is a big problem. We're not talking about one kid. This is worth your attention. I'm coming up with some reasons why, so I've already done my homework about why. I've diagnosed it, right? I'm not guessing anymore. And I've got some really cool and innovative solutions, and I can be innovative here, right? I can look at stuff that's going on in New York and other places around the world, stuff that are going on here, and then I can also say, you know what? I know that this has actually worked. Folks have actually done this in the States to solve this around homelessness, especially with public housing where landlords were getting ready to lose their contracts. They have 20-year contracts, and then they know how much money they're going to get, and they're getting ready to expire. They went and renegotiated new terms. Does this make sense? Yeah. And then your job is to then bring the partners together who are contributing to your annual targets and holding them accountable for delivering, so that ultimately by year 5, you solve that problem. You see my point? Because now you're managing people so 20 folks have said, I've got 60 properties. Let's say you got 60 units. Let's just say we got 60 units available, right? Yeah. So I'm holding those landlords accountable. I need these 60 units to have my people in them. You see my point? That's one strategy. So your job is to manage all of this. The systems response is, I need something in the regulation that can be rewritten to be rewritten. So I've got a legislative agenda where we've introduced some legislation to change something, right? And I'm holding the people responsible for that accountable for delivering on that as well. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
And then your job is to manage that. That's collective impact. That's you, and using the technique, the discipline of results-based accountability. And to me, collective impact, our community building without discipline is a crapshoot. And here's why this is so important. Because so often we'll say, oh, we got this problem, and we'll spend days talking about the problem. How many times you go to meetings and everyone keeps saying the same thing? And then when you say, so do something about it, people don't have a clue. That's why your job has to be able to structure the container. So you can move all these people who want to come in here and keep complaining. You got to move them through this process so they can take some action. So that's always my job, is to get people to move from talk to action. I know I've heard the problems before, so let's do something about them, right? That's why you have to be masters at your job, because otherwise all this gets bogged down and people start talking about what they can't do. Or they jump to their favorite solution that they haven't really thought through and it doesn't really apply here. So to me, I go through this process because I'm always trying to figure out what's the quickest way to get there, right? I don't want solutions that's going to take me forever. Well, hell, when all I had to do was just go ask the property owners. You see my point? This is where our common sense cannot be forgotten. You know, people come in with all their academic stuff and forget that, you know, there's something to be said for being street smart. Just go ask the property owners in the community.
Oh, go.
You see, does this make sense?
Yeah, it does.
And so I'm trying to show you how you weave it all together, because they really aren't separate things. It depends on how you hold the work and how you perceive it. Yes, ma'am.
And because I don't know, and I'm not wanting to sound negative. One of the challenges in our community, of course, is that there are less properties available than there are a need for accommodation, which is not unique to this community, I know. So I would imagine one of the challenges for us would be looking at how we can convince landlords around, you know, providing a property for a young person, when in fact they've got all these other people that are wanting property as well. Is that the truth?
But the young people would have full-time case managers to help.
So one of the things, you might have to have a long-term affordable housing strategy.
Yeah, because
right?
I was thinking about, I mean, we have, besides the state housing,
yes,
what's called community housing, they've provided now some accommodation for young people.
Yes.
I think they've got to be over 16, don't they?
Yeah.
Right. And so this is why this process is so important. There's multiple solutions to get you to serving the needs of 2,000.
Yeah.
You see my point? But if you don't have a structured process that you're walking people through, you get distracted on all this, right? We end up spending the whole hour talking about the problems of affordable housing, and we never get to, okay, so how are we still going to solve this problem? Yeah. We've given ourselves a dissertation on it, but we haven't proposed and agreed to do anything. You see my point? So your job is constantly trying to get people to get off of the description of the problem as quickly as possible. What I would expect is when you come to the meetings, you've already done your diagnoses. We're not coming to the meeting to diagnose. That was your prep work. When you come to the meeting, we're going to really put the solutions on the table and start really figuring out how do these solutions what combination of solutions actually gets us to serving this population. You see the difference? So now my meetings aren't about wasting time. Folks begin to understand, when I come to my meeting, you need to have done your job. If you haven't done your job, don't come in the room, because you're only going to make it worse. Because you're going to get people confused. How many times have you been in meetings and someone says something and gets the whole group off track? Now the meeting's gone, right? That's what happens when you don't structure the container. I need people coming having done the diagnosis of why these are evidence-based solutions that they want to propose. Don't just start shouting stuff out, right? That's how you get there. I always tell my team, I actually don't care about you describing the problem to me. That's why I hired you. I know you can tell me shit's bad. I actually want to help me understand what we're going to do about it. You see my point? So I really push people to stop telling me the obvious and help me understand how we're going to do what we're going to do, and then how we're going to lead people to want to play with us. See, that's the hard part, right? Because a lot of this we don't control, right? We don't control the property owners. We're not going to control the affordable housing strategy. We're not going to control the legislative agenda. These are all things that we're setting in motion, that we're managing, but we actually have very little control. So my time and energy has to be spent managing the politics, managing the interpersonal stuff, managing the conflict, keeping it moving. You see my point? and your staff have to help you. And so I have to have them coming into meetings. So I often spend a lot of time with my staff debriefing meetings, especially my younger staff who are learning how to observe stuff. I say, what just happened in this meeting? And they'll say something. I'm like, well, I said, okay, I saw something different. Did you see the Department of Education over there? They actually grimaced when we said X. You didn't pick that up, huh? Because if they don't get that type of stuff, that's where things start breaking down. You see my point? Or did you realize that when he said he had it, you talked for another damn 20 minutes? You just lost him. Yeah. You see all those little things? That's why I have to have a process so I can be free to do the things that actually keep us from getting work done. Because if you have somebody who gets stuff really quickly and they say, I got it, and you talk for another 30 minutes, they're not coming back to your meetings. Does this make sense? And so that's the adaptive work. We have to be awake to pick up on all these little nuances that actually get in the way of the work. And so our job as the manager leaders is to structure this process, get our teams organized to help us manage it, so that then you can get in that role of coach and person that's on the balcony, really seeing what's going on and how to make the necessary adjustments, right? Because there's gonna be times where you're gonna have to come in and really help the property owners work through some conflict. You're gonna have to be getting buy-in at the legislative level. You're going to have to be trying to get people to want to support an affordable housing agenda. That's our job as strategy makers. But you can't do that if this is just all willy-nilly. You see my point? And all the while I'm doing all this stuff, I'm still managing, and we're actually still making progress. We're not just talking. So same time I'm doing all this, we can still show we're getting progress, right? And that's the job. I want to get people to making progress as soon as possible in a disciplined way, and then keep managing this process. Another question? Yes.
I was going to say, interestingly, we've done some work in Victoria about that same issue, and some of exactly those solutions you're talking about is exactly what ended up happening, going to private landlords, asking them to take on people outside of the formal system, and it worked well. I think the thing that is really interesting is that notion around a disciplined approach. That happened in an ad hoc way.
Yes.
And it was really that stuff that you talked about around opportunities being very, very ad hoc. So
exactly.
And we saw that in the whole private rental system across Victoria, incredibly different approaches and no capacity to learn or understand, nor any sense of the size of the problem. So
that's right.
And I think one of the things that I find interesting about this is also the sort of cross-cultural stuff between you guys in the States, our systems, expectations around what the government does and what it doesn't do, and differences around philanthropy and how we might think about that.
That's right.
And in a sense, what you're asking us to do is take on roles that are not normally what service providers do. And so that's a big shift.
It's a big shift. And you know, even in the States, it was a big shift. And so I had to do this when I was at the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, because there was a lot of my colleagues who felt that their job was just to tell people no. You know, I didn't have to perceive my job that way. If I wanted to just sit at my desk all day, I could either join in community problem solving or I could just be a bureaucrat. There's a lot of room in between that than we usually think we have, right? You all really know a bureaucrat has a lot of power, either one way or the other, right? How you use it or not is your business. And that's the thing, just within what we currently can do. We can move a lot if we just tried, right? And so I know that at HUD because there's a lot of rules and regulations, and you know, I always figured out, realized that, you know, I can find a way to make this work if I'm really creative. I could also find a way to say no if I'm really lazy. You see my point? With the same wording and the same regulations. If I had relationships with folks in Washington, D.C., and then I had to call a legal counsel and say, hey, this developer's trying to do X. I think they can. What do you think? Now, if I didn't have a relationship with them, of course, the attorney's going to tell you no all the time, right? But if they trusted me, if they knew I really cared about helping communities and I had really helped them understand the problem, then they can join me in problem solving. You see my point? But that meant I had to want to be a different type of leader. That meant that actually, you know what, I'm just not going to sit in Chicago, not know the people who make decisions in DC and never talk to them, right? Because then they're not going to be responsive to me when I need them. That's our work. And so that's that relationship stuff, again, that Jim is talking about. This is one thing to know this academically. It's another to have relationships where people want to work with you to do it. And that's why it's really hard. There's nothing that's going to take the place of you having relationships with people to do this. But what it does allow you to do is hold the complexity. Because when I'm trying to go through this process, I'm always thinking about it at a program level. What can I do with a program to help this 2,000, right? I'm also thinking, what can I do at a systems level, right? I'm also thinking, what can I do in my role right today if nothing else changes? You see my point? I can operate at all three of those levels, and I need to. Person, role, and system. Now, how many of us think about things that way when we're trying to solve these problems? Usually what will happen is program people come in, and the whole conversation will be dominated by programs. And this may not be a programmatic problem that needs a programmatic solution. Or systems people come in, they get all grandiose, and before you know it, everybody's tuned out because they think this is going to be too hard and too long, and I'm just forget it, right? And then you have individuals who come in and who think they're just going to do it themselves, and they don't respect how complex the systems are. They don't respect the rules, so you end up quickly understanding they just don't get it anyway, whatever. So they just end up talking, nobody really listens, right? Someone, let's say if you're Jim, you come in and you say, hey, I just want 1,000 pots to bloom. I don't want to do all this discipline, and I just want to have good stuff happen. It just so happened that it happened in that case, right? Most of the times it doesn't play out that way. Or you have someone that comes in like me that says collective impact, and I got all this system stuff to tell you about. But then I don't know how to do the relationship building or community building piece. You see my point? And actually, neither one of them are wrong. I always say to people, pick something off the shelf and just get going. You could call it collective impact, you could call it results-based accountability, you could call it Six Sigma, you could call it community building. The question is, what is the discipline by which you're carrying out your work? And this is very important. Even if to me, collective impact, the only thing about it is, I'm trying to focus on a population, and I know that by focusing on a population, it's going to be too big for one person or one organization. That's all it is. Now the question is, can I bring in evidence-based practice to help me get people to work well together? And here's perfect examples. There's all sorts of science around how we should structure meetings, right? Start asking your team. So you called this meeting, help me understand the science behind why you're doing what you're doing. Oh, yeah, I just called some people together. We were just going to talk about a problem, right? That's why I start pushing back on my staff. You see my point? They actually think they're doing good. No, you're being lazy. And you're contributing to why people in community don't want to work together. Because you're wasting people's time to come to a meeting, and you haven't done your job to bring the best that we know about how to structure meetings, how to structure conversations. Have you thought about who's going to be in the room? Who doesn't like whom? Which organizations don't work well together? You see what I'm saying? If you can't tell me that stuff and you've called a meeting and then you're just going to stand in front of the room and watch all this dysfunction played out that you caused because you called the meeting, that's criminal. You see my point? And so that's why the discipline approach is important, because you can get on to really managing all this other stuff you got to manage and still know that I can let this meeting go crazy as hell. I'm still going to bring it back to, okay, before we go, can we agree on the indicator? And then the next meeting, okay, before we go, can we at least agree on one programmatic solution? And then I can keep moving them. You see what I'm saying? If I see that people are resisting a systems type of solution, okay, can we all agree, thumbs up on programmatic solution? Yes. Okay, what is it? Now we got one. We're going to go to landlords. Okay, because after every meeting, I want this. Action commitments. And I begin to put them in the room. The container always looks a particular way. You're going to always see this map in my container. I'm going to start seeing your action commitments, because all that should be helping us hit our targets every year. Setting up the container is just like setting up for a play. There's theatrics to it. And I got to keep bringing people back to the work. So often every meeting we jump in before we've reminded people what's the work we're doing, right? And so you're taking people to school without schooling them. You're helping them understand. Before we just jump back in, I want to help you remember. Last meeting, here's what we did. We agreed that there's 2,000 kids that need our help. We defined the problem. Then we agreed that we were going to try to find solutions that were either programmatic, systemic, and allowed us to take some action on our own in our agencies where we're at. We got to talking. It got a little heated. What we decided to do is that we would just take one that there seemed to be a lot of energy around in the room. We decided we would work on the programmatic response. Gretchen said she was going to go out and see if she could get a recruitment of some landlords. That was her action commitment. She came back and let us know today she's ready to report out that she got 45 landlords out of 60 to agree to do this, right? But it only gets us to serving, say, 600 kids. So today what I would like to ask us to do is if we can focus on a systems solution that we can begin to move. See how we did that? Now before the meeting starts, I've gotten everybody grounded in the meeting. Everybody's clear about what we're trying to do. I'm giving them a pathway to see themselves in the meeting. Programmatic, system, and individual. And I'm inviting them to allow me to facilitate them through it. And as the facilitator, I'm going to hold neutral. I'm not trying to advance my agenda. My agenda is to get you through this process. You can say whatever crazy stuff you want to, it doesn't matter. My job is to manage it and get us through this process, find the group's energy, and get this going. You see my point? And that's why your ability to center folks, help remind them of what they're in this room to do, what's our task at hand, and keep reminding them of that so they don't come in and think, oh, we did our job last week. No, we didn't. We did a piece of it. We did a piece of it. That's how you do it. Is this making sense?
Yeah.
I saw another question over here. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah. What if it, like, in Tasmania, it's a small area,
Mhm.
and often we've got service agencies fighting for limited resources, and they're sitting in the same room, and often they don't want to work together, regardless of what you do. How do you overcome that?
I don't try to. I don't try to. If I got 2,000 kids to need, there seems to be abundance. I don't think I don't have a problem yet of agencies. You see my point? And I don't even worry about talking about agencies yet because I haven't landed on the strategy. I might come up with a strategy where I actually don't need you. You see my point? So I might have agencies in the room, but I'm going to have community people in the room. I'm trying to solve the problem. Does this make sense?
Yeah.
I don't know if I need agencies, so I'm not letting them dominate the conversation yet. I'm having a community conversation about a problem. Does that make sense? That's a different way of structuring it. If you lead with agencies, you're setting up an expectation that there's going to be agency engagement, and it may not be ready. That may not be where we're at just yet. In this situation, yes, there's something for agencies to do, but it may not be programmatic and it may not need their money. I was giving people the perfect example in Hayward, California. Parents in promised neighborhoods, they were wondering why they weren't signing up for free health care for their children. What they discovered was when they surveyed folks, they brought everybody together, people started talking about outreach programs. We're going to do outreach programs, and we're going to do this. They hadn't diagnosed the solution. There was a policy put in place that said every 3 months, poor mothers had to go back and reapply. Now, those of us as middle-class Americans, who's going to take off work every 3 months, no car, go spend the day trying to reapply for health insurance? And why are you making them do that? We don't do that as middle-class Americans. See how dumb that is? It actually wasn't a money problem. It was a rule that just needed to be changed, and people had the power to change it. No one had just ever asked the question. And so that's a perfect example right there why if you could have started with an outreach program talking to moms only to discover that, oh, the outreach program only told us actually we didn't need to be doing the outreach program. We simply should have asked the parents what the hell was the problem and did our diagnosis. You see my point? Now, the question is, why didn't the agencies catch that? See, the reasons why the agencies didn't catch it because they were just doing their job. See, when you just do your job, you screw a lot of stuff up. If all you're doing is just your job. If you're not paying attention to the population, you're actually oblivious to what's going on with it. Does that make sense? If you're not paying attention to the population, you're actually oblivious to what's going on with the population. So you actually don't see that, wow, these moms have to keep doing this and reapplying. What you see is my job is to fill out the intake form when the mom comes. That's my job. So that's what I'm doing. I'm getting good evaluations for doing my job, but I'm not actually building community. You see the difference? It's not a criticism of it. It's just how you perceive your role. And that's why I say I can hold neutral as the facilitator on having to worry about that conflict. That's for them to fight it out in the parking lot about. Some stuff you don't have to take on, folks. When people realize that your agenda is to get results and their agenda is to act a fool if they want to, and you can manage it, you see my point? My job is to not worry about conflict and ignite it if it ain't necessary. And it's also not to take on someone else's work. If there's 2 groups in this room that don't want to work, my honest response would be, we're going to continue to work. What I would like to do is ask that after this meeting or a couple of days from now, you guys figure that shit out on your own. There's a powerful thing about adaptive leadership that's called giving the work back. You don't take on other people's stuff. That's work avoidance. See, if I get sucked into arguing about these two agencies, before you know it, I'm not doing this. You know what I'm saying? I'm excited. I feel fun. Especially if I like conflict, I get an adrenaline rush. I actually am not doing the work though. You see the problem? And so our job is always to make people do their work. And we do that by a thing that I call BART. I can send you all these documents if you want. It's called BART, the boundary of authority, role, and task. When I'm doing all this, I'm trying to get it clear about who's doing what. What is our agency in this group? Who's authorized to do what? And what I would say is, you know what? Before we start, we're making decisions this way. We're making decisions that are based on the best solutions that will serve this population. We'll let the chips fall where they may, but to be fair to everybody, we are going to look at them programmatically, systematically, and individually. The best I could do was be fair to everyone. You see my point? So everybody can come in the room. Everybody feels like they're going to have a fighting chance if they really have a good solution. And then if agencies want to be self-centered and advance their agenda, I have a respectful way to say, I'm sorry. You see my point? And then if they continue to act belligerent, I can ask them to leave respectfully. Or the group will. And it's amazing, when you have a structured process in a container, it's amazing how people get with the program. When they really realize, you know what, this is actually not the meeting that people are going to let me come and act out like I have in the last 20, they don't act out. They might try to test you, but as the facilitator, my job is not to fight you. My job is to keep you focused on this, right? So you want to keep pushing this agency thing. We don't seem to have an agency solution. What are you proposing? Because we're going to take a vote in the group. What are you proposing? See, now it's not about me. It's in them fighting, right? Because that's what people try to project their anxiety into you, right? They try to project their anger into you, so they'll start attacking the facilitator. Well, the facilitator just doesn't understand. We agencies have to know, what are you proposing to do as a solution? Because obviously, there's not one up here for you yet. You see my point? So my job is to manage all that. That's what your job is. And if you have a structured process, you can actually come into the meetings and you can actually do that. Questions?
Just sort of think out loud that on the one hand, if you're focusing on population, you have a particular population that you're wanting to work with, and there is a problem with that. Then, if you say take Launceston as child-friendly city, our population that we would be looking at is birth to age 18. So then, when we did gather data, we can see that there are some problems within that population that is a problem for well-being. So the coming together might be around targeting one that we think is going to get the best bang for the bucks up front, that might spin off onto some of the others.
You've just landed it. This is a subpopulation. The whole population would be, let's say, children from birth through, let's say, 24, right? We are talking about a subpopulation because we have data. Our data is telling us that this population is problematic. Let's say let's say that there's 10,000 in our total population. In the subpopulation, the data told us that there was this problem that we started addressing. You see my point? What we've learned to do is do collective impact for a subpopulation. When we get our act together, learning really how to do the adaptive work, struggling through conflict, struggling through answering things that are unknown, working in different ways. What we decided to do was take the population that was within our scope of responsibility, begin to learn how to do collective impact, begin to learn how to bring a disciplined approach. Now we can go and show other people how to do this as we join into the bigger conversations going on in community. Does that make sense?
Yeah, more thinking out loud. And it may be that has spin-offs. If we actually keep measuring all of the targets, there may be some additional spin-offs from some of those other targets.
Yes.
Nice. Then in walks Jim, and for us it's AKA Ravenswood beautifully won their community project. So, but in that whole scheme of things, the bigger picture of the Launceston as child-friendly cities would say that the Ravenswood project is in fact part of this bigger picture. So if we actually really did have a community impact model, then we would somehow be able to, and that's the agency stuff,
Yes.
is that Ravens would say, yeah, that'd be great, it'd be great for ourselves to see us within this, so that in the future we're not fighting for funding, but somehow there may be different groups putting fundings up, but the funding things that people are putting up actually sits within this bigger umbrella one, so that we're embracing every win that everybody gets, and we keep measuring across all of that.
So what I would say is don't even make it that complex right now. And I don't even believe in worrying about people being competitive. That's not my problem.
No.
It is a reality.
Yeah.
We are competing for funding.
But
And you can control for it by competing for results. See, there's a difference between competing for funding and competing to deliver. Does that make sense? If I'm kicking your butt, but I'm delivering for the children, I don't feel bad about that. I'm not actually trying to be collaborative. Join me in delivering on results. You see my point? That's part of the problem in our sectors, in the states. You got a bunch of mediocre organizations who are more concerned about getting their money than they are getting results.
Yeah.
That's why people are cutting our funding, because we're actually not delivering. We're fighting over the irrelevant. We're like little gangs. Let me have my turf. You see my point? My job as a leader is to say that's not actually my interest. My interest is getting results for the population, wherever they come from.
But if we keep measuring on a fairly regular kind of a basis, then what we're able to say is Ravenswood is working.
Yes.
And we're able to say somebody else is working, because
Yes.
we are continuing, and we will try and get the kind of support that keeps the measurements.
Exactly. And when you're able then to go and say to your other colleagues who may be in another city,
Yeah.
this is what we did and it works, and they start taking on this process, and then you both then go to the assembly or whatever it's called, the legislature, and you begin to show that you can make a case for this, watch people's attitudes begin to change. Now, there are some you're just never going to change them, but that's okay. My mentors always said you manage a third that's going to be with you, a third that'll be indifferent, and a third that just won't give a damn. And that's life, right? That's just life. But I can continue to bring people over to this. People who really are just not so tuned out to wanting to help folks, they'll get this. The reality is in the States, most people are saying no to this stuff, quite frankly, because they just know it doesn't work. But I'm just not going to say that to you because there's no sense in me getting in a fight with you. You see my point? I'm just going to be nice. What I've seen is when we ignite that we can behave differently, we can actually use data to solve problems like we got some sense, like businesses. Not trying to be a business, but we can take tools that other people have learned to use to improve society and bring them into our work. People pay attention. When we can bring a disciplined approach to this work. I mean, why should we be worried about funding if we're saying we're having meetings and we don't even know what we're doing? Think about that at a very basic level. We're asking people to give us more money and we're not even bringing any science to how we organize our meetings. That's pretty remedial. Every day we do it in the States. And yet we get mad when someone says they don't want to fund us. Think about that. So to me, before I start worrying about people who have a different ideology, I got to make sure my house is in order. Does that make sense? And I can tell you folks, our houses are not in order. We're running very sloppy machines.
I'll just say one of the things that you talk about a lot is around data.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that it's just become clearer and clearer to us, certainly in Victoria, I'm not sure about Tassie, the context of it, but that both service providers and to some extent government are really poor at being able to engage with data.
Yes.
For services, often they collect data endlessly and it gets sent off.
Yes.
But they don't actually engage with themselves to understand what's happening
Yes.
in their own services. And so for me, that's also part of the body of work to be done around understanding how do you get your house in order, which is actually about what are the skills you need to actually get that happening in the first place. Because for many organisations which are funded to provide case management generally, they're funded under a program space. There's a whole lot of professional development that can happen as you go along. The best way to learn is by doing.
Yes.
And to think about that in a way that means, because I think those assumptions about knowing what is the appropriate evidence-based work to do and knowing what the data is.
That's right.
Knowing what the population group size is.
Exactly.
They're all new things.
That's right. So when I was learning to do this work a couple of years ago, I was so mad. I was at the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, the federal housing agency, and I had gotten into the Annie E. Casey Foundation's fellowship, and they were forcing me to start doing this work. And I was like, the whole country is my population. Stop asking me questions. It took me 7 months to stop resisting, wanting to go get the data and learn how to do this. It's okay, people are gonna wanna push against it. But you're right, you do need to have a data agenda. You don't need everything, right? But we need to know, what do we need to know, right? Basic, what do we need to know? Because that's all the data we need. We don't need anything else. This is not a doctoral class. We just may need 3 or 4 or 5 data points and that's it, right? And then we just need to know, what do we need to measure, right? And then that becomes our data agenda. So as we're meeting, one of the things we always do when we set up the container is in every room, we always have the data up, so that people are doing a data walk and it's grounding folks. It's amazing how people stop acting out when you're grounding this in the data. When they actually see the population that you're talking about, people stop acting crazy. But when there's nothing in the room and it's just like this and anyone can throw out anything at any time and say whatever and get people excited about it, watch what happens. But when you imagine setting up your room, every time you come in the room, you've got this flow. This is what we're working on. And on this wall, here's our data, right? And on this wall over here, here's some solutions we've agreed to. Person, role, system. Almost if you set this up like you're teaching kids, right? Here's our process. Person, role, system. Here's our solutions laid out that way. Imagine if you started doing that, because now people are learning as they're doing the work, right? That's actually how adult learners learn. Adult learners only actually learn when they have a problem to solve. That's evidence-based practice. Adult learners only learn when they have a problem to solve. So even when you come to conferences like this is why we forget about 90% of this stuff, because we haven't connected to something that's really burning for us. So it's in our background and in the back of our heads, but we can't access it, right? So our job is to know that. So I'm gonna set my room up like a classroom, because I know that those visual cues and things like that is actually how the folks will learn how to do the work. Does that make sense? And before you know it, people are starting to say, okay, have we thought about person, system, solutions in our role, solutions in our group? Before you know it, I'm not even having to say that anymore. You see my point? Oh, where's our data at for this meeting? Have we looked at it yet? Let's take some time to celebrate some of our progress. You see what I'm saying? What's our action commitments before we get out of here? Does that make sense? And before you know it, you've got people in this rhythm. Your meeting should be just like a rhythm. Just like if you're going to do a tango dance. There's a discipline to doing the tango, right? And when people come to your meeting, they understand they're coming to do this dance. They're coming to your meeting to do the tango. And this is how it's going to go down, right? And that's what I'm teaching them. Same way you bring a child into a classroom and you're trying to get them to understand. My classroom looks this way for a reason. I'm trying to get them to learn some concepts. They see those concepts on the walls. They're reinforced by my instruction. They're reinforced by the things that they do together, etc. I'm doing the same thing with adults. And I'm not getting all fancy with the words and stuff. Does that make sense? I'm walking them through the process. Because the hard part is getting the adult to want to let go of the things that they care about. So remember when I said yesterday, let go of loss? What you just raised is what we have to help agencies through, right? I can't just dismiss the fact that they're going to feel some competition. I can't just dismiss the fact that we're saying you're important, but you're not the most important. So my job is to accept that some people are going to come in the room with that perspective and not to attack it, but not to be distracted by it either. Does that make sense? And that's the work of community building. And to also be able to ask ourselves, what is the work for community to be doing in this? We don't have to do all of this. We may not need to. There may be roles in communities like we found out with that property management. Does that make sense? That's, no matter how sophisticated people try to make this stuff, that is it. Now, is it hard to do? Yes, because it's hard finding those places where the data exist, then working out the agreements with the institutions to give you the data, right? But when you get this set up, now we can get to the hard stuff, right? That's the hard stuff, and that's where I'm like, okay, now we're doing the work, right?
But even that idea, yes, you may have trouble getting data from institutions, but I think going back to your point yesterday, you know, don't go and create a new computer system when you might be able to buy one off the shelf. That most organisations collect data.
Yeah.
So the question then is, well, what can we make of that? And
exactly.
Even though the data may not be perfect, is it enough for us to understand how to act?
Exactly. And you know what you can use? There's a couple of things you could just use today right off the shelf to just dump some data in and get somebody who's really good at it. You could use Excel. Or if you went to the Results Leadership Group's website, they have what they call the Results Scorecard. It has this process embedded in it that I'm using, and it's really cheap. And we bought that for our network because what I wanted was to be able to make sure that folks did not have to rely on me to do this process. When they go to community meetings, they should be using the scorecard to walk people through this process. Does that make sense? That's empowering folks and making sure so they can go get the results scorecard and do this work. And all this stuff then ends up being in the scorecard. And at the end of the meetings, you can record the action commitments. So when you come back to the next meeting, that scorecard is back up on the wall and I can report out the action commitments. You see my point? Now I'm using a management tool. My container has been created because the Results Leadership Group has a scorecard that has results-based accountability embedded in it. So now people can walk through all of this stuff. That's our job. So that's actually what we bought for our network. On top of the case management system, we bought the scorecard so that they can do that. And now our job is to help them get through that. Any other questions? Yes. Take care.
Sorry, putting up a
Bye-bye.
The issue about funding programs
Mhm.
which are population-based,
Mhm.
potentially
Mhm.
for a population-based. Where does the funding and how did you move in the States from, or decide funding for this? Because I'm a bit.
Well, once we land on the strategies,
Yeah.
we can then start talking about funding. What we're able to do is take this throughout the entire state and do this work, and then the entire nation. So your money is actually helping us leverage a new way of working across the country. And folks love to do that. So we could go to our foundations or our business leaders and do that.
So if we were looking at putting it all up in the air and refunding,
Mhm.
from a government point of view,
Mhm.
is it a little bit by saying there's this quantum of funding for this population solution, we don't care how you do it, just tell us
Well-
how you're going to do it for
Well,
them.
that's what you would hope that they could eventually get to. And so as you guys work then as an agency network and you're lobbying and advocating for funding, you're able to go as a group now and say, where usually I would go and argue for my own thing, 5 of us actually can go now because there's enough for all of us. You see my point? So by focusing on the population, it becomes an abundance thing. It was too big for all of us. That's why I was only serving 50 kids in the first place. You see what I'm saying? But I was worried about holding on to my 50 and maybe getting 2 or 3 more every year. When I join forces with everybody else, we become a big coalition that needs to be dealt with, right? So when folks start having that budget conversation, we're right there. And we're talking about our interests, right? And we're then able to back it up with our data and show you what we're doing differently. Then people start looking at what you're doing versus what everybody else is doing and like, something special is going on over here. You see my point? That's how it happens. That's how we've come onto the scene in the States in 3 years and blown past a lot of folks who have been doing work for 20, right? Because I knew my competitive advantage was not to just start doing stuff. I've got to help develop confidence that actually what we're doing is going to be different than all the stuff that's come on before it and hasn't really worked. And I cannot tell you, that is part of the reason why we can't inspire people. People are just tired of us not being able to deliver.
Do you know, I think this really ties in with Jim Deere's work, and I come from the northwest of Tasmania, which is a small rural community. We've got a Devonport community house there, which started off ground up, and still is basically ground up. But because of their data they've been collecting, they started a men's shed, which is part of a larger community of men's social building.
That's right.
Collateral. And with the data, again, they get more money to put into the system, and they open up new initiatives.
Yeah.
But it started from ground up with no idea, really, where it was going to end up, but they collected data along the way.
That's right. And imagine when then you go to another community and you tell those property managers, you know what, can you call your colleagues across town? Tell them that this really is a good thing, it works. That's community building, right? You try to take this to another community, you actually don't have to do the sales job. You get property owners talking to other property owners, because they do talk, right? And they're able to make the case for you. Your job is done. You see my point? Where it would have took you 2 or 3 months to get known, get someone to feel comfortable with you. These folks come in and just say, hey, it works. I get my checks every month. It's a good thing. Those youngins aren't tearing up my property. Does that make sense? There you go. But as simple as I'm making it, you see all the complexity, right? There's a lot of in this, and that's the exciting thing, and that's what we have to manage. That's why we have to be good at what we do. Because you get distracted too easy. And I can tell you, in my 61 member network, it's taken me 3 years to get them to want to agree to the software, agree to want to use results-based accountability, to start actually doing it, getting the Department of Education to actually buy the scorecard, so it wasn't just coming from an outsider like me, and now to begin to say to folks, I want you to have baselines, targets, etc. See, before I was just doing all this and people were looking at the department and the government was saying, I don't have no point of view about it. So they were like, well, it's nice that you're telling me to do it, Michael, but I got my $30 million in the government and asking me to do this. So I don't really know if I want to do it, right? Because this is work. And I already got my money. But what I had to help our network understand is you got money for 5 years and then you're going to be screwed all over again. And you won't have learned how to do the work better. You will have done the same old thing. And then when people start calling for results after giving you $30 million and you're able to tell this little teeny bitty story, then people are going to say, see, I knew we shouldn't have started this new program again, right? That's why when you start hearing things like no new programs, that's why. But there's nowhere in our society where newness is not welcomed, other than in our sector. Most things where new stuff isn't being introduced is the closed systems, and closed systems usually atrophy and die. But since we can't control it, we just say no new stuff. Anything out of President Obama, no. Even if it's good, even if it reflects that we're gonna fix all the stuff we didn't get done right in the previous years, just no new stuff. We've been able to start breaking through because of this. Does that make sense? Perfect example. This program is too early to be evaluated. One of the senators, the report just came out today. The General Accounting Office looked at Promise Neighborhoods to see if it was going to be, to assess its efficacy. Should it exist? The only thing they could say was, they don't know if the Department of Education can evaluate Promise Neighborhoods. That's a really big deal. That's good. And the reason why that's good is if we didn't have this stuff in place, they could have said they don't have good controls. They don't know what the heck they're doing. They don't do. All they could say is, I don't know if you can evaluate a program. Well, we're 3 years into a 20-year journey. It's too early to evaluate anyway. You see my point? So that's not really saying anything. You see my point? But what they were looking to say is, we went out and interviewed all these people and looked at their work, and they don't know what the hell they're doing. They're not focused. There's no results framework. There's nothing. There's 10 results, 15 indicators. There's a disciplined approach. We bought the data system, saved the Department of Education's butt. You see my point? So when the GAO came calling, of all the federal programs that have been started by the Obama administration, what they saw was this is the most rigorous one being implemented. You see my point? Now, right now, I'd be sitting here screwed if I didn't ignite that conflict and anticipate. I know I'm in a political environment. I know the General Accounting Office is going to look at us. That's like our auditor. And they're going to be looking for the problem. And so I'm going to sit here for 3 years and act like I don't see this coming. And then be shocked and mad at them when they hammer us, right? For what? Being undisciplined. No results framework. No indicators. No evidence-based programs. Now imagine if we had just left this to the community. I'm going to give you $30 million and you figure it out, community. Think where we'd be at today. Be a different report. You see my point? Folks, this is what's at stake with this work. We're losing this battle because we already know how the game is played. We just don't come up with better solutions to anticipate it and head it off. Now, when I go back to my hotel tonight, I can write a response to the GAO report that says this was a great report because it stated the obvious. You see my point? It stated the obvious. I don't know if the department can evaluate it. Because what do we know about trying to evaluate human-based programs? It's hard to evaluate them anyway, right? First of all, nobody wants to pay all the money that it really costs to evaluate this work. We're not doing control groups and stuff. We're not lab rats. So by its mere nature, it's hard to evaluate. That's why I'm saying they didn't say anything really intellectually riveting. The best thing they did was not be able to say that it was bad. Now I can go and rock and roll. And that's huge, folks. And we saw this coming 3 years ago. The only thing we didn't know is when the GAO was going to call. And here's the power of the network being disciplined. They went to every implementation site, there's like 12 of them, and then they went to some of the planning sites, there's 42 of them. And they didn't tell us where they were going. You see my point? Then they met with the Department of Education, and then we called them up and said, you know what, let us tell you our story too, our story of results. And we met with them and blew them away. And I could rest assured that when you go to the sites, even though it was early, they may not know how to do this, but at least they knew how to talk about it. You see my point? And that's a victory. They may not have known how to do this yet, but they knew how to talk about it. And at least the folks who looked at it could say, something actually different is happening here. Everywhere I go, I'm hearing results and indicators and performance measures, and we're trying to figure out where we go on our targets. You see my point? So it's not just that this stuff is great for getting results. It actually does help you begin to position yourself politically in the realities that we all operate in to be successful for the long term. And this is just a really real world example of why it plays out. If you go right now onto Google and you typed in Promised Neighborhoods GAO report, you'll read the report. But that's what's at stake with this work, and you all can do that. I'm happy to send you all any of the tools that go behind this so that you know it. It's all in a book called Trying Hard is Not Good Enough by Mark Friedman. His book has that, but there is also some tools that I use, like there's a BART article, there's a conflict app, there's a whole bunch of other little tools that I have that I could share with you, like one-page things that you could have as you begin to set up your meetings. There's also a results-based facilitation guide. So when I'm talking about holding neutral in the container and all that, it explains how to facilitate in a results-oriented manner so that you can actually hold the meetings and hold this type of stuff. So if interested, I'll send you all that. Just in case, let me just give you all my email. Is at Michael. It's just michael@policylink.org. I'm happy to send you whatever you need. Has this been helpful?
Yes.
Your job is to hold all of this content and make it so simple people don't even realize you're giving it to them. That's our job. And this is why people don't get it. Something very exciting happened this morning, which was that you could see in the audience, people were like, well, which view do I take? Jim or Michael? And we've got to be very careful about how we confuse communities like this, right? Because if the facilitator hadn't stopped and been awake in that moment, that's exactly one of those moments in meetings that you all will be in, where it's in a moment where this group can go south on you and you lose them, or you can make it a teachable moment, right? And she sensed what was going on, and she wasn't so stuck on her script that she couldn't get off of it. How many of us go to meetings and someone's got a PowerPoint presentation and they got to get through every slide, but we already got it. And they just keep hammering the point and they miss that nuance to say, wow, this group is about ready to have a breakthrough, instead of stopping and saying, help me understand what I just sensed. What's going on? Because that's what she did today. And that's when she said, Michael, come on up here. You see my point? It isn't either or. And the worst thing you can do is let consultants come into your community, start selling you snake oil. Right? It's not collective impact. It's not community building. It's not asset mapping. It's all of it. The question is, can you put it in a package that actually works for you and will work for your community? Does that make sense? That's our job, because in 3 more years, someone's going to come up with something else. And these conferences will be centered around that. And you'll still be saying, yeah, but you know what? This process is working pretty good because it's delivering for results. You see my point? We can just call it something else, but we're going to continue to do this. That's our job. Some things can be enduring, folks. Some things can be enduring. Getting results with discipline it will endure all the fads that will come and go.
Some of that evidence-based information is the sorts of things that Michael's doing, so that you can incorporate that if you're within that same.
That's right. And if you guys want evidence-based stuff, you can go to what's called What Works. There's a What Works database. Have you all seen it? What Works database is a database of all sorts of really cool evidence-based things that work in the world. What Works database.
Michael,
thank you all. I'll answer your question.